Joe Kent is the former US head of counterterrorism, who resigned this week in protest at the Iran war. He posted a dramatic resignation letter in which he said Iran posed no immediate threat to the United States and that the US had been dragged into the war by Israel. And he's now expanded on those claims in an interview with Tucker Carlson.
And just to be clear, there was no intelligence that showed an imminent threat. There was no intelligence that showed they were on the cusp of building a nuclear weapon. There was no intelligence, indeed, that showed they were trying to build a nuclear weapon. And nobody said, I've seen it, but you haven't. It exists, but you just haven't seen it. Did you ever hear anybody say there is intel that shows this?
I did not, no. But I know how this works. I know the Israeli officials, some in intelligence, some in government, will come to U.S. government officials, and they will say all kinds of things that we know from our intelligence just simply isn't true. And they'll say, hey, I'm giving you a preview. It's not in intelligence channels yet, but here's what's going to happen. And that doesn't usually come to
Wait a second. I mean, I thought that U.S. policymakers made their decisions on the basis of intelligence collected and or vetted by our intelligence. That's why we have intelligence agencies that soak up hundreds of billions a year. But you're saying that Israeli officials short-circuited the entire U.S. government and just went right to American policymakers and said, it doesn't matter what your country says, here's what we know? Is that what you're saying?
I mean, usually they're pretty slick. And
of course.
And they'll say, hey, this isn't in intelligence channels yet because it's going to take some time to get there. And here, they're on the cusp of building a bomb. You know, they're going to, I don't know, you pick your topic. A lot of times they'll sample different things until they find what sticks. But in general, the narrative about, they're going to do a preemptive attack or really just they're going to build a nuclear weapon. And if we don't stop them now, they're going to build a nuclear weapon.
Now, in lots of contexts, that would seem like a ridiculously simplistic idea of how Israel might influence US foreign policy. But with Donald Trump, kind of makes sense. And to be honest, maybe even with Joe Biden. Think about him saying publicly he'd seen pictures of beheaded babies. Who was it who told him that evidence existed? Was that Israeli officials throwing out any idea they had until something stuck? And Ken also explained how the media plays a role here. Let's go back to that clip.
And enrichment is the pathway to that. They're going to continue enriching at whatever percent. Enrichment became the narrative. And so that hung up and that short-circuited and really sabotaged the entire negotiations because the Iranians basically said, like, we're not going to negotiate if the whole starting point is no enrichment. And again, that had nothing to do with a nuclear weapon, and the Iranians essentially agreed to that. So the Israelis came in, they moved that red line, and they would do a lot to say, like, oh, they're enriching. And you know what that means? That means in X amount of time, they could have a nuclear bomb. You have to ask now. And then the way the ecosystem would work is that the talking heads on TV, your Mark Levin's, Sean Hannity's, et cetera, they would say basically the exact same thing that night on TV, or there would be a piece written in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, that would say something very, very similar. Yet, if you looked in classified intelligence, we didn't see any of that.
Again, this kind of makes sense with a guy like Trump. You have Israeli officials and politicians feeding him made-up intelligence directly. Then you have pundits repeat that on TV, and lo and behold, ultimately this idiot thinks maybe bombing Iran is actually a good idea. Barry, what do you make of Joe Kent's argument?
Yeah, I think that we've seen this before, and in terms of Trump responding to stuff that's planted in the media or echoed by the media. We had this in his first term where he sort of infamously used to sit down and watch Fox and Friends and, occasionally phoned in, but apparently would be heavily influenced policy-wise by what he heard on Fox and Friends. But this whole Joe Kent episode, it's extraordinary. I mean, just to set up who this man was, he was the head of what they call the National Counterterrorism Center, which was set up post 9/11 in order to coordinate the different intelligence agencies in the US, because one of the things that they believed in the wake of 9/11 was that a reason that it hadn't been detected was because the intelligence agencies had not been talking to each other. So he headed up this place that brought the CIA, the FBI, the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security together to coordinate. So this is a man who knew about US intelligence at a really, really high level. And so for him to walk away and do this is remarkable. And I think that the key thing I took away from the Tucker Carlson interview, and it's the key thing that I took away from Joe Kent's letter, was, the simple declaration that Iran was not an imminent threat. And so therefore, the US has gone to war. on a false pretense. And then couple that with Tulsi Gabbard, who, the director of US National Intelligence, who yesterday appeared before the US Intelligence Committee, which I think is a thing that happens once or twice a year. But she, again, was straight down the line on this. And I actually pulled a quote up. She said, as a result of Operation Midnight Hammer, which was the attack on Iran's nuclear facilities in June last year, as a result of Operation Midnight Hammer, Iran's nuclear enrichment program was obliterated. Right now, we also heard that from Trump in June last year, that it didn't exist anymore. So that is now, look, it's something that we knew. It's something that was obvious. But now Trump has two very, very senior intelligence officials coming out and confirming that it was complete nonsense that Iran posed any kind of imminent threat. Gabbard went further. She actually said that they hadn't managed to salvage anything or make any new progress since the attacks in June of last year. So, attacking Iran was never a MAGA project. It's hugely unpopular in the US. He's going against the US public on this. He's going against a lot of his base on this. And I think, as you alluded to earlier, we have midterms coming up in the US in November, in which the House and Senate are both in play. I was actually talking to somebody earlier today who's a former US government official, was until very recently a US government official, who told me that, even the Senate is in play. Now, it's very hard. The Republicans have a majority in the Senate and in the House. It's very hard to flip seats in the Senate. But in terms of flipping seats in the House, I think they only have a majority of 5 in the House. All the maths are showing that the Democrats right now have a very strong chance of flipping the House. And if that happens, then what Trump is left with is what they call in the US is sort of a lame duck presidency. And it's going to make it very difficult for him to get things done, notwithstanding executive orders, which can only take you so far. So Trump is in an incredibly difficult spot domestically as this thing continues. Hegseth said today it's going to cost $200 billion. A war that's already incredibly unpopular with the US population. How do you think that's going to go down with the US public? So he is in a really, really tough spot. And now to have Tulsi Gabbard and Joe Kent come out and say that there was no reason to go to war with Iran and that the reason that was given was a pretense, I think this is really, really tough for Donald Trump right now.
Certainly agree with that. This, however, is the most explosive part of the interview.
And then, Charlie Kirk is killed publicly in a very horrific way, and we're not really even allowed to look into that at all. And Charlie Kirk was one of President Trump's closest advisors, and he also advocated heavily against a war with Iran. He was in the Oval Office in the lead up to the 12-day war. I wasn't particularly close with Charlie. He was very gracious to me when I was running for Congress, very, very supportive. So we knew each other. And the last time I saw Charlie Kirk on this earth was in June in the West Wing, in the stairway. And I said hi to him, and he looked me in the eye, and he said very loudly, and it's a small, you've been in the West Wing, it's small, it's a tight space. And he said, Joe, stop us from getting into a war with Iran. Very loudly.
He was single-minded.
And he walked off, and he went, I believe, into the Oval. So when one of President Trump's closest advisors, who is vocally advocating for us to not go to war with Iran and for us to rethink at least our relationship with the Israelis, and then he's suddenly publicly assassinated, and we're not allowed to ask any questions about that, it's a data point. It's a data point that we need to look into.
What do you mean when you say we're not allowed to ask any questions about that?
We've been told that this individual, Robinson, is a lone gunman, and maybe he is. But the investigation that I was a part of, the National Counterterrorism Center was a part of, we were stopped from continuing to investigate. And the FBI will say that they stopped that because they wanted to turn everything over to the Utah state authorities. Everything's going to trial. It's very, very sensitive. But there was still a lot for us to look into that I can't really get into. But there was still linkage for us to investigate that we needed to run down. And I'm not making any conclusions. I'm not saying
No, I don't think you are.
because of this happened. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying there's unanswered questions. We know the pressure because of the text messages that have been made public that Charlie was under a lot of pressure from a lot of pro-Israel donors. And again, we know Charlie was advocating to President Trump against this war with Iran.
Barry, we are used to hearing wild conspiracy theories from Trump appointees and from guests on the Tucker Carlson show. But that's quite the claim that is being made by Joe Kent there from someone who is, until this week, the head of US counterterrorism. Do you think there's anything to this, or is he just stuck in the Candace Owens cinematic universe?
There's a way in which I just don't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole. I mean, it's pure speculation, but from me or anybody else who tries to decode this, because there's absolutely no evidence of anything like that. Yes, of course, it's significant that this man, who I actually said earlier was in this incredibly important position, would say this. But then a lot of the people in the Trump administration, and he's a political appointee, have kind of weird checkered histories where they have leaned into conspiracy theories. So I don't know. Look, do I think it's likely that Israel assassinated Charlie Kirk? No, not really. And I don't think there's any evidence to point to it. But who bloody knows these days? Up is down, down is up. Everything's insane, particularly in the US. So who knows? But I am not really touching that.
Yeah, I think, as far as I can see, claims that somehow Mossad is involved, potentially, right? I think that's for the birds, really. But I do think that questions really need to be asked about the reaction from the Trump administration if they are totally making their counterterrorism unit hands off, right? There's some kind of justification in my mind that the Trump administration will have for getting their counterterrorism unit, again, for somebody who murdered somebody politically, right? It was a political murder that was done. Somehow counterterrorism isn't involved. And I want to know what the Trump administration's rationale was for. We'll leave it up to the state in Utah. Again, do I think that Israel are involved? I think that sounds like crank conspiracy stuff to me. But we have seen how the FBI have acted in response to Charlie Kirk's assassination. And again, this doesn't look like normal behavior for what institutions like this would do in the case of a high-profile assassination like that.